I'm Laura Thomas. I'm Director of Communications at the Tavistock in Portman. Thank you very much for joining us for this event tonight, Shapes of Identity. This is part of our Centenary Festival. So we have a number of events running through this period. If you go to our website or to our Eventbrite page, you'll find more events on all sorts of topics that the Trust takes an interest in. So the format for this evening will be a presentation from Domenico Di Ceglie, who was the founding clinician for the Gender Identity Development Service, and a response from Felix and Rowan Moore. Polly Carmichael will be our chair, and she'll be doing formal introductions in a minute. For the talks, we will not have the chat open, and we will take questions after the talks. And if you could raise your hand to ask a question, that's the best way to go about that. Obviously, this topic is a topic that gets a lot of polarized positions and strong views. We would ask, of course, that everyone tonight is respectful of everyone else in the room, and in the tone of their questions and in the manner in which they approach the topic. And as you've seen when you joined the room, the meeting is being recorded, and it's our hope that we're able to share the recording from tonight after the event. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Polly, and enjoy your evening. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Laura. So a very warm welcome to you all, and thank you so much for coming along in the evening. I've heard Domenico's talk, and I think it's a really stimulating talk, and I hope we'll have time for some reflections and questions at the end of this. So many of you will know Domenico, I'm sure. Domenico founded the Gender Identity Development Service in 1989 at St George's Hospital, and shortly afterwards it moved to the Tavistock where it stayed. In 1995, Domenico set out some therapeutic aims for the service, which included unconditional acceptance and respect for young people's expression of their gender identity. And this isn't a statement about people's trajectories, and within it holds openness to a range of outcomes. And I guess that's one of the key things I often think about when I think of Domenico, which is his curiosity and also ability to support young people and their families manage uncertainty. Domenico's also written a book, which some of you might have seen in 1998, A Stranger in My Own Body. And I think to have started a service which in 1989 had, I think, 2 young people attending within a year, and a service that has grown and grown, and importantly, I think, has extended its reach in terms of equity of access across the country. I think you need to have perhaps a tenacious personality, and I can certainly personally vouch for Domenico's tenacious personality. I came to GIDS over 20 years ago now for a visit, and subsequently was persuaded to come and do a short sabbatical for 6 months. And somehow I'm still here 20 years later. So I think Domenico certainly has a touch of magic about him, really. Domenico's roots are in a psychodynamic perspective, but it's integrated in a framework of group and social dynamics and family work and empirical research. And I think that reflects the philosophy of the integration of several perspectives within the service over the years and continuing. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Domenico for his talk.
Thank you, Polly, for your very kind introduction, and thank you, Laura, and the organizing committee to give this talk at the Centenary event. I'm sorry that I cannot see people, and so I have no verbal or non-verbal or visual feedback to what I say. So I feel rather lonely there in this room. This presentation describes the early history and the origin of the Gender Identity Development Service, GIDS, and of its model of care and philosophy. Within the centenary events of the Tavistock, it seems particularly appropriate to reflect on the foundation of a service which has a focus on the complex dynamic of identity development, and in particular of gender identity. I will do this by describing briefly 3 cases which made a significant contribution to the construction of the original model through the use of observation and imagination, in the words of Donald Meltzer, as well as of clinical experience and available empirical research. This is a painting of Pierre Bonnard. Why to use this painting? Young Women in the Garden is one of the most extreme examples of a painting made over a long period of time. Having started work in 1921, Bonnard put the canvas aside for many years before revisiting and revising it in 1945. Resuming his work was part of an attempt to rediscover the original experience, bringing it into the present without losing its place in the past. In this presentation, I will use a similar approach to that of Bonnard to 3 cases that I saw in the past and published and disguised. I will look at these cases from a new perspective applied to the case material, their impact in the creation of a model of care for children and adolescents with atypical gender identity development or gender diversity in today's language. Case 1, Jennifer, which is not a real name, was 16 when she was referred in the 80s to the adolescent department of the Tavistock Clinic, where I worked as a trainee, following 3 suicidal attempts. She had been assigned female at birth, but perceived herself as a male. She presented very distressed with depressive episodes and a number of features which at the time were considered borderline. Today, we would have looked closely for the presence of autistic spectrum feature, as she had difficulties in communication and avoided eye contact. But at the time, this association has not been discovered as yet. A large part of the session was spent in silence, which pleased me because I could record what went on verbally in great detail and show it to my supervisor. At the time of the referral, Jennifer was still living in a female role, maintained her female name, and wished to be addressed using a female pronoun. She was uncertain about physical intervention. Her mother, who had died just before Jennifer came to the clinic, had suffered depression after Jennifer's birth, and her father had been physically violent towards his wife during Jennifer's childhood until they separated. During her psychotherapy sessions, she remembered episodes when her father, in fits of temper, had kicked her mother in the stomach. In one session, she admitted, and this was not without a sense of embarrassment and shame, that she had identified with him, an experience that she could not explain. She loved her mother, and her main aim in life was to do something extraordinary that would have made her mother happy. A bit like the character in the film $1 Million Baby. There was no recollection that Jennifer herself had been physically abused by her father, but witnessing violence between her parents had been a traumatic childhood experience. It is possible to hypothesize that the way Jennifer coped with the fear of damage to her mother and possibly to herself was to identify with a male possessing the strength of a masculine body. Once established, this gave her a sense of survival and also a sense of protecting her mind, in her mind, the damaged mother. A female representation of herself had to be strongly avoided as it was equated in her mind with being weak and damaged. Another important factor also seemed to play a part. After the birth of the 2 older sisters, her mother had miscarried a baby boy. And when she told me this, she said, and my mother miscarried the baby, And then there was a long pause. And then she said, and the baby was a boy. I thought she had made a connection between herself and the loss of this child, of this baby. And I didn't say anything because I felt there was no need to say anything. She had made the link herself. 1 year later, Jennifer was born. Jennifer seemed to feel that her mother had expected her to be a boy. And in one of the sessions, she alluded to her mother having psychic quality, as if she had been part of a magical experience in which she and her mother could read each other's mind. This could be an experience that some people within the Tavistock might call projective identification. She had probably received and made her own her mother's wish that she had been a boy. Her mother probably never consciously expressed this wish, but possibly it remained unconsciously active in the relationship between them. 2 years of psychotherapeutic exploration with this young person allowed the therapist, together with Jennifer, to make this partial reconstruction of her childhood relating to her atypical gender identity development. However, any attempts to explore this understanding further with Jennifer led to continuous interruption of therapeutic work. She would disappear for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, which might have indicated her extreme resistance and fears of having the foundation of her gender identity revisited. Even if Jennifer retained some of this understanding, it certainly did not alter her gender identity development. That is to say, the sense of who she was. Her male gender identity seemed to be well established and fixed. It formed very early in life, and it is likely that traumatic events had played a part in it. Towards the end of the therapy, Jennifer was able to live in a male role with a male name, and this well-being improved. He did not attempt suicide again. He settled in a job, and he was more able to establish relationships with other people. One might say that their therapy had helped him to cope with his well-established gender identity in a better way, to make the transition to a male role, and to give him a sense of hope, an important therapeutic aim. He was eventually referred to an adult service for further treatment. I became aware in working with Jennifer that I was fundamentally dealing with the developing identity and not a psychiatric condition, long before there was a legal recognition of these new identities in many countries. A question, however, remains: what conferred continuity to his atypical gender identity development? And maybe a neuroscientist would have something to say about this. This case shows that the combination of an exploratory and accepting attitude could be a good approach in terms of promoting well-being. In this case, the main focus of the work was the amelioration of the associated psychosocial difficulties. I later realized that these are present in a number of cases. Reflection on these cases led to the original formulation of the therapeutic aims in working with children with gender diversity, as we say today, and their family. And these are the therapeutic aims as they were summarized. There is a full description of them in my book, which was published in 1998, although maybe some part of it might be outdated. The first point was to foster recognition and non-judgmental acceptance of the gender identity issues. Then to ameliorate associated behavioral, emotional, and relationship difficulties. To break the cycle of secrecy. I don't know how important it is this now that there is much more openness in society, and if in family still secrecy is used. 4, to activate interest and curiosity by exploring impediments to them. And there was an interesting dynamic around curiosity with Jennifer, though I don't have the time to explain it, but it seemed that curiosity was a barred activity both for her and for me. And I interpreted this at the time as the fact that Jennifer's mother was depressed during her early childhood. And so probably she was unresponsive to the curiosity of the little baby. And so Jennifer then interiorized this and then perhaps projected also into me, so letting me have the experience of what was like not to be able to explore. To encourage exploration of the mind-body relationship by promoting close collaboration among professionals in different specialties, including pediatric endocrinology. To allow mourning processes to occur. I've seen some cases where a child has developed gender dysphoria following the loss of a very significant adult, like a child where, for instance, the grandmother with whom the child had spent a long time together and because mom was at work, developed gender dysphoria soon after the grandmother died. And when all this was, I suppose, explored, the child shifted and changed and could be able to talk about the loss of the grandmother. 7, to enable symbol formation and symbolic thinking, which sometimes is affected in these children and adolescents, and to promote separation and differentiation. To enable the child of the adolescent and the family to tolerate uncertainty in gender identity development. And finally, to sustain hope. That's very important, I think, because it keeps people alive. And so maintaining the hope that the solution to the difficulties between the mind and the body will be found. It is important to add to this list the need to combat stigma, which is often associated with the experience of atypical gender identity, and which is at times internalized by individual experiencing GD. It is also valuable to alleviate the feeling of shame that some children and adolescents and their family experience, and enable people to develop skills in handling social interaction and dealing with possible hostility. This therapeutic approach is developmentally based, is not prescriptive, addresses the young person's distress, and aims at promoting well-being. It is not part of reparative or conversion therapy, but as element of affirmative therapy. And I remember very vividly the bewilderment that this created when I presented this model at an international conference in 1992, because people were surprised that the service, which was specifically with children with gender identity disorders, as it was called at the time, had not as main aim to change the identity of this child. In one of the last sessions, after 2 years of exploratory therapy, Jennifer said that perhaps this form of help had come too late, and that her parents should have been aware of how she was feeling by the way she behaved as a child. She wondered why they had not sought help at the time. Jennifer's thoughts made me wonder why there was no service for children with these rare conditions, and unusual but also distressing. And this planted in me the seeds for a creation of such a service. About 3 years after this, I saw Jennifer around 85, 86. GIDS was established, as Polly said, in the Department of Child Psychiatry in 1989 at St. George's, and in 1996, the service transferred to the Tavistock and Portman NHS Trust. Case 2. Britton, in his book, Belief and Imagination, distinguishes between beliefs and fantasies. He states that beliefs have got consequences. They arouse feeling, influence perception, and promote actions. And of course, if beliefs about one's own identity will promote action, which might involve, for instance, wanting to modify or change the body which doesn't fit the identity perceived. Fantasies, instead, he says, conscious or unconscious, which are not the object of belief, do not have consequences. Disavowal, therefore, can be used to evade these consequences. Therapeutic exploration will help to clarify these two different states of mind. The following interaction illustrates the level of conviction of belief of a 13-year-old assigned female at birth whose self-perception was of being a boy. This interaction occurred in a family session involving the mother, the stepfather, the young person called Fred, a child psychotherapist colleague, and myself. The metaphor which I use in the following clip, which we'll show in a moment, came to my mind after reading an article by John Morris, who recently died. And the article was entitled "On the Sadness of Living Abroad." As he was talking about people like me, I thought I would read the article. And here she describes the psychological experience of some English people who had migrated to France. Today, we could call this experience the migrant dysphoria. She says, "It is not just that I'm sorry for the French who are going to have to suffer the proximity of these cuckoos in the nest of the world. In a way, I'm sorrier for the English who are going to turn themselves into expatriates. All over the world, one sees them, the islanders, evading their heritage, looking for the London newspaper in the Spanish news agent, talking about Duchess at the New England English Tennis Club, and above all, almost anywhere beautiful in France, visiting each other's houses, remembering old times, comparing Major with Thatcher, Gooch with Bottom. How happy they always say they are, how sad they generally seem to me." Now, this clip, which I show in a moment, was broadcast in around 1995, so more than 25 years ago. And it would be interesting to see, what our guests also think about how actual the debate or the conversation which is going on in this family is relevant to today's situation. Mike, can you show the...
Lie ahead. And if that's the general aim of this meeting, then.
So we were wondering, sort of, where do we go from here? What do we do from here? I mean, besides getting on with living, but I don't know. That's what worries me the most, is what the future holds for Bexy.
Bexy.
Sorry.
What do you, sorry, I interrupted you.
No.
But because you made that remark, I thought that perhaps it was the moment to ask you, how do you like to be called now?
Now? I don't, certainly not Bexy.
No. What would you like us to call you?
I don't know.
We've kind of got past it because we just call Fred, but when I hear somebody else calling her Becky or something, then
Why do you say her too?
Sorry.
That's the hardest bit.
It's the he and the she, because it's really difficult. And I feel weird calling Fred her and she. Yeah, I feel weird calling you it.
Is that the bit that hurts the most?
Yeah. She does it all the time.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. Particularly with your mother or with everyone?
No, Dr. Di Ceglie calls me it too.
Yeah.
And Brian.
Yes, but does it hurt the same?
Yeah.
It hurts the same.
I know you'd rather be called he, but I do try, I promise. We both do.
But it is a difficult issue, I think, how to tackle it, because it's a bit similar to, say, an English boy, born in England, brought up in England, who at 15 or 16 immigrates and goes to France, and then goes around and says to everybody, "I'm French, and I want to be considered French," while his accent will show that he's not French, because it's so. This is I mean, we're trying to bring.
That's not it though, because he wants to be, he isn't.
No.
But I am.
But that is one of the problems, because of course what your body says is different from what you feel inside you are. Like in this person, what he would like to be, because he would like to be French, is different from what his accent, at least, no other features.
But I don't want to be, I don't like to be a boy.
You are a boy?
Yeah.
And which way do you see Fred going? More back to being a female or more to being a male?
What do you...
Being more back to being a
I mean,
female.
it can only ever be a guess.
Some people say that
knows.
with puberty they can turn back into being a female. How do you see
We get told Fred will grow out of it. We live with Fred every day. Fred grows into it.
Yeah.
Fred has asked us specifically on several occasions to to not call you Fred, but because you've always been called Fred ever since you were incy, but to say he and not she, and he's explained that it really, really hurts when someone says she. And also it's ever so complicated if I introduce him as she, because people think I've gone mad, so...
You sound as if you're just doing it.
Because you've asked me to.
Yeah, one of the reasons. Why aren't you doing it for you?
Also for me, because eventually if you do go ahead and have all the treatment, I'm going to look...
And why do you use if too?
Well, alright then, when? I'm going to look pretty stupid if I'm the only person on the planet calling you she.
Oh, so it sounds as if you're just worried about what you do.
No, it's for you and for everybody. But what you need to understand is it takes some time for somebody like me to readjust. And I do try really, really hard, because the last thing I want is to upset you.
When she's on the phone to a friend, she referred to me, about me, as she. And it's as if she's doubting me.
No, Fred, that was in one instance with another
No,
parent.
Mum.
That was, be fair. When I talk to my other friends like Gabby and Glynis, I say he, except when I make a mistake. But to that other woman I was saying she, but there was a specific reason for it.
My ears must be going funny then.
Well, there was. Very much so.
But the important point that you're saying is that you feel that there should be no doubt about who you are.
Yeah.
In this case, that you feel you are a boy, and there should be no doubt that you are a boy. And when you pick up any doubt about it, or that people are uncertain about it, that's very upsetting for you. That is what you're saying.
The interesting point here is, can you hear me?
Lie ahead. And if that's...
The interesting point here is that when Fred asks mother, to be called by to use a male pronoun, then the mother says, "I'm doing it for you." To which then Fred reacts and says, "Why don't you do it for yourself?" And I found that very interesting, because what Fred is saying is, if you do it for me, that means that you have another perception of me in your mind, which doesn't coincide with my perception. And so there is a request that the two perceptions should be the same. And of course, this opens up the whole issue around mourning. I think in this situation, the fact that the mother or the parent in cases like this have to mourn the child that they have, because the child that they have is they have to mourn the child that they had in their mind, and in order to accept the child that they have. Fred's perception of his male gender identity persisted until he was in contact with the service, and at 18 he pursued further treatment in an adult service. This case shows the value of a psychotherapeutic exploration in helping to distinguish between gender identity presentations which are more solid and presentations which are more fluid and changeable. The material from this case in particular enabled the formulation of the so-called Atypical Gender Identity Organization. The characteristic of this organization, which of course is the underlying organization, internal organization, which underlines atypical gender identity development, could be as follows: rigidity and flexibility, or to use other words, solidity, fluidity. This refers to the capacity of the atypical gender identity organization of the individual to remain unchangeable, or alternatively along a continuum, to be amenable to evolution in the course of development. Organizations which are more rigid or solid will contribute to the persistence or continuity of the atypical gender identity development, while organizations which are more flexible or fluid will lead to shift in gender identity development. In about 10 to 30% of prepubertal children research shows that the gender dysphoria continues into adolescence. After puberty, persistence or continuity into adulthood is much higher. That would mean that, at the age of 12 or 13 or 14, then the persistence of the atypical gender identity organization or development will persist in a much higher proportion of cases. Another parameter of the organization is the timing of the age of formation. Atypical gender identity organization that develop very early in child's life may be more likely to become solidly structured than organizations that develop later. The early onset of gender dysphoria is in fact one of the criteria for considering early pubertal suppression. And then traumatic events in childhood. It can be hypothesized that in some cases, an ego might be formed as a psychological coping strategy in relationship to a traumatic event in childhood. The earlier the trauma occurs, the more likely it is that the organization will acquire unchangeable quality. And the position on the paranoid schizoid depressive continuum. I usually skip this item because it is too complicated to explain, but in this case, I will read it. The Klein-Bion model of psychological development posits a continuum from the paranoid schizoid to the depressive position. An individual oscillates between these two positions or mental state in the course of their life. Precisely where the child mental state resides along this continuum where the ego is formed is of significance. And the hypothesis here is that if the ego is formed during a period of development within the mental functioning of the paranoid schizoid position, it is more likely to become very structured, to have the quality of a solid identity and therefore less amenable to change. Alternatively, if it is formed within a mental function of the depressive position, it is likely that the organization will have more fluid qualities and be amenable to evolution. Therapeutic exploration may be able to elucidate the characteristic of the organization or the shape of the gender identity of that particular individual and therefore guide management. But of course, one could reach similar conclusion coming from another perspective. Case 3. Martin was referred to in the early 1990s to the Gender Identity Development Service at the age of 8 when he was attending a primary school. The educational psychologist reported that his mother said that he had told her when he was 7 that he wanted to be a woman when he grew up. He enjoyed dressing in women's clothing, and ever since he could walk, he liked to wear high heels and use tea towels to mimic long hair. He was very fond of Barbie dolls, and his mannerism and style of walking were feminine. At school, he played only with girls. He lacked confidence and was teased by other children who called him offensive names. He suffered from symptoms of anxiety, including stomach upsets, dizziness, and headache. His mother did not encourage his feminine behavior, but was supportive. During the assessment at GIDS, we confirmed that Martin presented the feature of a well-established gender identity disorder, now we would call gender dysphoria or gender incongruence. His anxiety about attending school resulted in poor attendance, and he also experienced teasing on the estate where he lived. He also had difficulties separating from his mother. At our server, we started working closely with the family, which consisted of Martin, his mother, his stepmother, and had meetings with the school to facilitate his attendance at school. 2 years later, Martin moved with his family to another town in England. Here, his wish to live in a female role became very intense, and the parents agreed to let him live as a girl, expressed by dressing in female clothes and changing his name to Martina. In her new town, Martina became involved in individual therapeutic work with a community nurse in the local child and adolescent mental health service. A colleague and I continued to see the parents every 2 months to help them to reflect on the gender identity and other developmental issues involved, and to be able to make more informed decisions with their child. The parents attended a group for parents with gender dysphoria for 6 months. We continued to hold regular professional network meetings, including school staff, 2 or 3 times a year. And these meetings are very important because it's a way of integrating different input. And of course, integrating different input from staff coming from this different perspective. If I remember correctly, for instance, the community nurse who saw Martina in therapy came in fact from a training, I think, which a Rogerian training. So as you can see, there can be differences in the belonging of professionals. And so that's very important, I think, to integrate this through a professional network meeting, also to avoid that split occurs. And splits occurs in this area very frequently, I think. And so there needs to be a structure which can facilitate the integration of different input. Martina attended a special educational unit in a female role, following careful preparation and discussion of the issues involved between the professional network, including us, and the family. When Martina was 13, the social service department called a child protection conference, as the school had become concerned that parental attitude could have contributed to the development of Martina's gender dysphoria. After an investigation and a child protection conference, no child protection issues were found. As a result of this conference, the mother was offered further supportive individual counseling by local services. When Martina was 14, while waiting to be seen by our pediatric endocrinologist as she was entering puberty, she unexpectedly announced to her mother that she no longer wished to be a girl, and she now felt happier about being a boy. And I remember vividly this, our mother communicated this to us, or to me, because I was in a team meeting and a telephone call arrived, and the secretary came. They said, there is the mother of this boy who wants to talk to you, of this girl, she said, who wants to talk to you urgently. And usually I didn't take telephone call during the team meeting, but in this case, I was worried that Martina was suicidal or was very distressed. So I rushed to the telephone, and then the mother quite calmly said, we need to cancel the appointment with the pediatrician because now he wants to be a boy. From then on, Martina reverted to living as Martin. The next time I saw him, he had physically developed a lot, and he had a clear appearance of a boy. At the last professional family network meeting, I asked Martin if he thought that his parents had made the wrong decision in allowing him to attend school in a female role. And he replied without hesitation that it had been right because that was how he felt at the time. From this case, which I saw in the 90s, I drew the following conclusion. Pubertal development can sometimes, even in well-established cases of gender dysphoria, change the course of gender identity development. A parental response, which goes along with the intense wishes of the child to live in the perceived gender identity and role, does not necessarily influence the course of gender identity development. However, maintaining an open mind facilitates the process of change if this occurs. My professional role was to maintain a reflective approach in working with the family and the professional network, evaluating pros and cons, and to facilitate decision-making within the family regarding what was in the best interest of the child in that particular social context. There is a very limited research evidence to suggest which approach to children living in their preferred gender role social transition during childhood is best. Long-term follow-up studies, as I've mentioned, have shown that only a small proportion, up to 30% of prepubertal children presenting with the feature of gender dysphoria, Did the gender dysphoria continue through adolescence and adulthood, with or without any therapeutic intervention? Stima suggests that among young people who changed, the period between 10 and 13 years of age was considered to be crucial. So this is the window where change will occur. After that, usually children who have persisted will continue with their atypical gender identity development and so become transgender people as late teenager or adults. Both persister and desister stated that the change, this is still Stima, that the changes in their social environment, the anticipated and actual feminization or masculinization of their bodies, and the first experiences of falling in love and sexual attraction had influenced their gender-related interest, behavior, feelings of gender discomfort, and gender identification. My initial thinking about the management of gender role and social transition in childhood was based on a long-term observation of the case I described in the 1990s. Since then, I've seen a number of prepubertal children and found that the exercise of autonomy in decision-making on the part of the parents and the child has been an helpful policy. The provision of a therapeutic exploration jointly with the family and the neutral profession is helpful. The exploration would aim at enhancing the capacity for autonomy in the family, and in this way lead to better informed consent to what is in the best interest for the development of the child, and in particular of their gender identity. The value of therapeutic explorations and counseling with young people and their family could be seen from a new vertex. Their role in the service of the ethical principle of autonomy and better informed decision-making. Long-term follow-ups and further research in this area will contribute to the continuous development of appropriate guidelines. To conclude, in this paper, I've tried to show how reflecting over a period of time on case material as Bonnard did with painting can allow a process of learning from experience in the world of being and contribute to the development of models of care for different shapes of atypical gender identity. As clinical experience and research evidence evolve, so will models of care. The management of gender dysphoria in a number of young people may require for the young person and the family decision-making regarding hormonal intervention. There is a risk in our digital age and current cultural climate that the process of evaluation and assessment becomes rather mechanical and simplistic. The role of a therapeutic exploration may be to promote the development of autonomy and better informed decision-making in young people and their family. I would like to end with a metaphor which stimulates a reflection on the nature of gender diversity in children. Recently, the Chinese artist Ai Weiwei created an installation at the Tate Modern in London, which he called Sunflower Seeds. This extensive mass of seeds, 120 million, seen at a distance, look uniform and undifferentiated. But as one looks a bit more closely, the individuality of each seed becomes more and more evident. There are no two seeds which are the same. And as you can see, this is quite an undifferentiated mass. Starts to become more differentiated. And here you can see the difference between the seeds. This is Ai Weiwei. And these are the difference between the seeds. And this is the individual seed. Ai Weiwei explained that each porcelain seed was individually painted by workers who collaborated in the project and not by a machine. So each seed required between 3 and 6 strokes according to the ability or style of each collaborator. Therefore, the diversity of the seeds was the result of the collaborative process between the artist and the workers and the collaborators. In a way similar to this work of art, children who present with atypical gender identity development all present differently within this category and not as part of a stereotype. It is therefore important to offer different types of help according to a range of diverse needs. One size fits all cannot be applied to this group. Instead, as professionals in society, we should respond empathically and flexibly to the particular experience and story of each young person. Thank you. Polly, you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, the dreaded mute button. Thank you so much, Domenico. I hope that everyone can hold their thoughts for a short while, because next I'm very pleased to say that we have Felix and Rowan Moore here with us, who have agreed to make some reflections following Domenico's talk and talk about perhaps some of their experiences. So Felix, in his own words, is a transgender autistic actor and activist who trained at Drama Studio London. He's played the lead role of Adrian in Rotterdam for BBC Radio 3 and has appeared on the Today programme, in the Daily Telegraph, and at the annual conference Autism, a hands-on approach to discuss transgender and autistic issues. And Felix is here tonight with Rowan. Rowan is an architecture critic in The Observer, but is here tonight as Felix's father. And Rowan has written about transgender issues in The Observer. So I'd like to extend a warm welcome to you both and hand over to you.
Thanks, Polly, and thanks for asking us to do this. As you said, I don't have a particular structure to what I'm going to say. This is just my reflections on Domenico's talk and how I feel like it resonated with my personal experiences. I was struck, first of all, that one of the key aims of GIDS is the unconditional acceptance and respect for young people's gender identities. I think that young people often are not given very much agency in expressing their own identities, not just in this area, but just as a general societal rule. So I think it's really important that that is one of the key aims and has been from the start. In the first case study, I was struck by Domenico's description of Jennifer as potentially being on the autism spectrum, because as you mentioned, I am autistic. I'm very interested in the overlap between trans identity and autistic identity, because there is considerable evidence to show that there is a statistically significant overlap between those groups. There's an increasing amount of discussion about it, and somewhat inevitably that discussion is often very focused around, well, why are autistic people more likely to be trans? And I don't think it's necessarily it's not necessarily wrong that people ask that question, but I do think that it is the wrong thing to focus on. There are various theories about, like, well, why is this? And ultimately, I don't really think it matters if you're dealing with an autistic person who is also trans. The way that people often phrase it when they're talking about a particular person is, well, would they be trans if they weren't autistic? Or is so-and-so's trans identity just quote unquote an autism thing? And my response to that would be, well, you can't know. If someone is autistic and they're trans, then there's no point in saying, well, would they be trans if they weren't autistic? And I think that speaks to a misconception that people have about autism in general, which is that I think people sometimes imagine that autism is a sort of shell which is formed around a quote unquote normal person, and that if only you could break through this shell, then the real person would be revealed. And what I don't think people understand is that the autistic person is the real person. Autism is integral to who I am as a person. There is no part of me that isn't autistic. So if you say, well, like, how would you be different if you weren't autistic? You're saying, how would you be different if you were a completely different person? And I don't have an answer to that. I would be a different person. And consequently, if I am trans because I am autistic, that is only true in the sense that everything about me is because I am autistic, and therefore I don't feel that it is a productive line of questioning to say, well, like, well, you wouldn't be this way if you weren't autistic, because the fact is that I am, and I can't not be, and there isn't a version of me that you can't summon a different version of me from a parallel universe who isn't autistic and see if that person is also trans. In saying this, I appreciate that the perspective of a psychologist and a person who, a trans person or an autistic person are always going to be different, because my focus is more on, like, what it's actually like to live my life, and I don't spend that much time, like, pondering why I am the way I am. I just go about my life. But I do think it's interesting to talk about, rather than saying, well, like, why are autistic people more likely to be trans? I think a more interesting question to me is, what do the experiences of autistic and trans people have in common? And one thing that autistic people and trans people have in common is that we are very often not listened to, particularly when we're talking about ourselves, which is, partly why I appreciate being asked here today. But so it's kind of a double whammy sometimes, because when I was aware that I was autistic quite a long time before I was diagnosed with autism, like 5 years, I think. And I had difficulty in getting a diagnosis. I got a lot of pushback from, people, including medical professionals, when I asserted that I was autistic. And then, having received my autism diagnosis, I then found that people doubted my trans identity because I was autistic. So it's just, I think people who are both autistic and trans can experience like something of a compounding effect, where autistic people are less likely to be listened to, and trans people are less likely to be listened to. Dad, do you have any comment on that?
Yes, gosh. I think what you said about the shell and this idea that being autistic is something that you can take off.
Yeah.
Is exactly the same thing in relation to transgender people. And this is a point I tried to make in the article I wrote recently, is that people who are not close to transgender people think that it is something you can take off, that it is a kind of an act.
And they tend to have quite a shallow understanding. I mean, that's a generalization, but quite a lot of people that I have spoken to tend to have quite a shallow understanding of trans identity, and they think that it's basically about external factors. Like,
yes, but they also think they don't understand how fundamental it is.
Yeah.
It's not something you can take off and put on. It's not so a tattoo. It's not fancy dress.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of underlying an awful lot of the kind of misunderstandings in the debate at the moment is if you look at some of the points that are made, you think, well, you wouldn't really be saying that if you really got that point.
Yeah.
If you really kind of, that you are really telling people to be someone they're not. So if people say, well, maybe it's okay for teenagers to wait a few years until they have treatment or something, you just wouldn't say that if you understood that point.
Yeah, you wouldn't say that if it was like a different condition. And I think there's something that's a little tricky about language here, because being trans isn't a condition per se, you know, it's an identity, but it is something that for some people, not everyone, for some people requires medical intervention. And I think that can be really difficult for people to understand. Like, well, if it's an identity, then like, why would you need medical intervention? And I think kind of a relevant metaphor is like, if somebody is pregnant and they don't want to be pregnant and they want an abortion, they don't have a condition. Being pregnant is not a condition, it's not an illness, it's not a disorder, it is like a healthy and natural thing. But for the person who doesn't want to be pregnant, it is intensely distressing to be pregnant, and that person needs an abortion. And that is like a necessary medical intervention, despite the fact that it is not a medical intervention to cure something, but it is still a necessary medical intervention. And in the same way, a trans person, they don't have a disorder. There is nothing physically wrong with their body, but nevertheless, because they are the person that they are, medical intervention may be necessary, whereas somebody else who has the same body, if somebody else was in the same body, they wouldn't require medical intervention. And the point is not that there is anything wrong with their body in a physical sense. It is that it is wrong for that person. And I do appreciate that can be difficult for people to get their heads around, but that's why I think the abortion metaphor is relevant.
Can I say, a couple of other things relating to Domenico's presentation. One is the case of Jennifer, who had this terrible childhood and presented as a trans person. And Domenico described how, through quite extensive therapy, they came to the conclusion that Jennifer's feelings of being in the wrong body were solid and real, if you like. So I know, I'm not an expert on this debate at all, but I know there are people who would say that Jennifer's self-description as wanting to be a different gender is somehow not real, that it's somehow a kind of response, a misplaced response to her or his trauma, and therefore that it's a kind of fake cure, if you like. So I'm very interested that Domenico came to the conclusion that he did. And it might be interesting to know a little bit more about how you tell, the difference between somebody who thinks they're transgender, but really there's some other reason, and people who really are transgender.
Can I just?
Yeah.
What I would say about that is, it may very well be true. I can't speculate about someone I don't know. It may very well be true that Jennifer's gender identity was influenced by their childhood. It may also be that may also be the case for other trans people. But what I would say about that is that everyone's identity is formed by their life experiences. There's not a human being on the planet who isn't formed in one way or another by their childhood and their experiences. So I think in some ways it's sort of
well, again, that's the person they are.
Yeah, it
for
sort of
whatever
misses
reason,
the point.
so.
Like that person, well, like you can speculate all day about like, well, like why is this person like this? But the same is true of anyone. And the fact is that you have the person in front of you that you have in front of you. And I think in the majority of cases, particularly with young people who need urgent intervention, it's far more productive to focus on their needs now and to focus on, you know, what they need now and in the future, as opposed to like, well, what would have been different if they had been different 5 years ago?
I also found the video with Fred and his parents very powerful, partly because Fred was such a strong, impressive character. But it does very simply portray, you know, what is a common experience between trans children and their parents, because it obviously is challenging for parents. You know, when your child comes out, suddenly your child is not the child you thought they were, and you know, all sorts of pictures you might have in your mind to do with related to the gender you thought your child was suddenly, you know, change. Although I would say that is a particularly dramatic version of something that should happen between all parents and all children, which is that the child is never who you thought they were, and that's just a sort of rule of life. And if you don't learn that as a parent, then that's something wrong with that.
Yeah, if you have a child, like you have to be prepared for that child to be anyone or anything. Like you can't.
I mean, your child just will surprise you no matter what, and that's what should happen. And then you do, you know, you are torn to some extent, or you have several different emotions at once. You want to give all the support you can. You do have doubts. You say, is this real? The younger a child is, the more you have those doubts, because parents do think that's with their children. That, you know, again, parents probably do that too much of not, you know, crediting their children with knowing who they are. And whoops, sorry, a cat was about to appear in the video. But it is a natural thing of parents to question their child's judgment about all sorts of things, and sometimes parents are right about that, and sometimes they're wrong. And you know, then you discover it is real, and you discover how powerful it is. And you know, among other things, it's very difficult to be trans. It's not something anyone would do for fun, because it is difficult to go out in your new identity, especially to start with, when you don't really look the part. You know, when you takes a bit of learning to look.
I've seen various people in the media, and I'm sure like other people say that, like, suggest that some parents are encouraging their children to be trans because they don't want them to be gay. There was something in like The Spectator, I think, where someone said like, oh, well, obviously if somebody's son comes out as gay, well, they would rather have a daughter than a gay son. And I find that remarkably perverse, because statistically and in the experience of like every trans person I've ever spoke to, the reverse is I've never heard of that happening, and the reverse happens all the time, i.e. like a trans person will come out to their parents and then the parents will say like, oh, but why can't you just be gay? And it also assumes that parents would be resistant to having a gay child but not to having a trans child, which seems remarkably unlikely to me. if someone is hostile to gay people, that they're pretty likely to be hostile to trans people as well. Like, generally speaking, more hostile to trans people than to gay people. So yeah, I guess I just wanted to address that as something I hear sometimes. And I think people who make those sort of suggestions imagine that you just sort of, if you come out as trans, you just sort of click your fingers and then are universally and immediately accepted as your gender. And I can report that that is very much not the case. And is not the case for basically any trans person that I have ever met. Like, it's, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you both for your reflections and thoughts. A really great compliment, I think, to Domenico's talk. And I think you've raised some really interesting questions. I think particularly, Rowan, the question around whether an identity can be a response to trauma, and what that means, and how you tell the difference, I think you said. And I thought maybe we could start by asking you that question, Domenico, to sort of comment on that bit of your talk, whilst everyone else collects themselves and puts forward any questions you may have.
Well, my reply would be that if there are traumatic events, they can occasionally become embedded in identity development, but that's not just for transgenders. It could happen to other identities. If you look, for instance, in religious identity, this person could have easily developed a religious identity. Nobody can predict how the identity will shape, because we are not robots. And that's the beauty of it. But of course, events, your own history, in some sense influence your identity development. And of course, it can take different shapes. One is, I suppose, in this case, of course, the shape it took was for Jennifer to feel was a male, but it could have been different. She could have found a different solution to that particular events during her childhood. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is about the autistic elements. And I tend to see especially, autistic traits as contributing to a particular style of thinking or a particular style of life. And of course, then this can, in some sense, affect how you live your own life. For instance, I was thinking about, Greta Thunberg. She became an activist for an exceptionally good cause, and probably, but what fuels her interest, her enthusiasm, is her autistic states. If she was not autistic, probably wouldn't have the energy that she has in pursuing it. And so there is a value in that. And of course, in other type of conditions. So this would be my two comments to it. That in some sense, these elements sometimes enrich the personality, because these are personality traits which, of course, work together with other aspects of the development, of the identity development.
And yeah, as I said, like, I'm not particularly interested in any particular theories about like, why is there this link? But I would say that I think autistic people take less at face value than the rest of the world. The ideas about gender that we hear and that we're taught, we are less likely to sort of just accept, like, well, everyone says that I am a boy or a girl and therefore I must be. I think autistic people, because we see the world differently than other people, we question those things more. And I think that can lead to us having a more expansive and a more unusual view of gender and of ourselves. And I think it's significant that like quite a high proportion of the autistic people who are also trans identify as non-binary, as opposed to as a trans man or a trans woman. And I think that is because autistic people fit less well into sort of societal roles in general and into gender roles in particular, and we're more likely to reject those roles. And I think that at the risk of self-aggrandizing, I think that is a trait in our favor. I think It's one of the things I like the most about the autistic community.
Thank you. So I'm going to throw it open for people to put up their hands if they have any comments or reflections. There's a lot of screens here, so I'm not quite sure how this is going to work. So Mike, I'm just flitting through the screens and I'll carry on doing that. Michael, I see your hand is up. Michael, can you hear me? I think you're on mute.
Yes, there's somebody called Kathy, sorry, Polly.
Oh, Kathy, so Kathy next, yes?
Hi, hello. Wow, first of all, I just want to say how rich and wonderful I found tonight's speakers, all without exception. This has been a very, yeah, it's been quite a profound experience for me. So thank you all so much. There is so many things I could ask, but I'm going to try and be very concise. Felix, I noticed that you made an observation about psychologists and their way of understanding people with autism and trans people. I feel like I need to confess that I used to be a psychologist myself, although I hope I was a little bit more human than you describe. But actually it links to the question that was in my mind for all of you, for Felix, Rowan and Domenico, which was simply how to be a good ally to trans people. And Domenico, I was seeing that your approaches were really about facilitative conversations and keeping openness and non-judgment there and supporting people to come to their own decisions in their own time. But any comments on how to be a good ally, I would value as a human and an ex-psychologist. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I should say that I wasn't in any way denigrating psychologists. I just think it's worth pointing out that we have inherently different approaches as someone who is studying a group of people versus someone who is part of that group of people.
Yeah.
And in terms of being a good ally, it's going to sound facile, but just like listen to people, listen to trans people about their experiences and listen to autistic people about their experiences and listen to trans autistic people. And if you don't know something about a particular topic, those are the voices that you should seek out. I'm very aware that the media climate in the UK right now has a lot of discussion of trans issues and almost none of it is by trans people. I think someone did a study of, I can't remember which newspaper it was, that they had published something like 312 stories about trans issues in a year and none of them were by trans people. And this is something that is very much the case for both autistic and trans people. The vast majority of people who are considered authorities on autism are not autistic. And if you seek out resources about autism, most of them are aimed at parents and not at autistic people. So if you're an autistic person and you're looking for help for yourself, it's very frustrating and kind of dehumanizing to just find all of these resources where it's like, yes, I know it's very hard to be related to an autistic person. Because that is the tone of a lot of autistic resources.
Given us a task now, Felix, I think.
Yeah.
Domenico, do you have any response?
I think Rowan hinted at it when he said, I suppose, that in whatever family you live, you have to eventually accept diversity, which means that, the idea that you have of your son, of your daughter, might be very different from what they have in their mind. And you have to come to accept that your child is going to be somebody different and separate from what you imagined. And so that there is a variation, because that could be in the field of, for instance, of religion. You might have a son or a daughter who chose a different religion from the what you have or you don't have, or have other areas of interest. So that's, I think, is the crux of the problem. If you can accept diversity and value it as an enrichment, then makes life much easier.
Thank you, Domenico. So I've managed to get a list of hands up in order. Ross Withiel, I think, had something, but I don't know whether you've decided against it now.
No, I haven't. Thank you. So I want to echo Kathy and thank you to all the contributors for just such a rich evening. But also ask Domenico, the case of Martin or Martina, what do you think it is that contributed to what seemed to be like a sudden change?
Probably that in that case was development or the change of the body. But it is difficult to say, because sometimes change occurs without any fact which can be totally predictive. And this is the problem in this area, that one has to live with a certain degree of uncertainty. Fortunately, because we are not robots. If we were robots, then you probably could predict exactly what would happen. But because in our with our humanity, we are different individuals, we can reach different conclusions. Now, probably in that case, the change of puberty, contributed to his change, but I wouldn't be sure 100%. But I suppose what was important is to keep an open mind to it. Although he was living in role, or as Martina, we always discussed with the family the possibility that things might shift or change as a possibility. And so that keeps open the possibility of shifts if they occur.
The thing that really struck me about that case was the fact that, Martin went, having lived as a girl for several years, went back to identifying as a boy, but also that he was very clear that his parents allowing him to live as a girl was the right decision because it was the right thing for him at the time. Because I think a lot of people who are very worried about young trans people worry that if someone identifies as trans for a few years and then their identity changes, then that is in some way permanently damaging. And I think that is viewed as like the worst possible outcome, when there isn't really evidence to show that like it is like necessarily a really bad thing. And he seems to have had a good understanding that his parents being accepting of his former gender identity was the right thing for him because it was the right thing for him at the time. And I don't believe that because somebody's identity changes, that means that the identity that they used to have was wrong. I've identified in various ways throughout my life, and I wouldn't use those labels to describe myself now, but that doesn't mean that it was wrong when I felt that way.
Thank you. So we have Jeremy Clark, the next hand up.
Thank you very much. So lovely to see Domenico, and I was struck by your Bonnard painting and your reflections about time that I think you spoke to us at the Albany Trust about your work way back in the late 80s or early 90s it would have been. So it was really beautiful to hear about your reflections over time on your work. And thank you also, of course, from me to Felix and Rowan. It's also a real privilege to hear from yourselves on this kind of event. So thank you, Polly and Louise, for organising it in this way. I wanted, I mean, in services, we're always pressured by time. And that is one of the difficulties, that in the NHS, time constraints and the amount of time available and the amount of time we can build relationships with our clients and our patients is always under pressure. And I don't see there being, as it were, any kind of solution to that. But I wanted to ask a different question really then about how we manage that constraint and find a way to agree a focus for the work that we can do in the time that we have available. I suppose what I was struck by in Domenico's presentation was just how collaboratively you approach that, with the young person and their family really at the center of agreeing what the focus should be. But I just wanted people's thoughts and comments on that.
I feel that's more for Domenico, but...
Shall I start? Or?
Yes, yeah. Please.
Well, I think what I suppose I try to show is that collaborative work means working, between the service and also outside posts. So that allows for people, for instance, to benefit from therapeutic work locally because they don't have to travel and so on. But what it needs is a good coordination among the professionals, which what I called the professional network meeting. Now, of course, with this disaster that we are experiencing this time, there might be an advantage that at least we have now a way of communicating. So what in the past the professional network meeting meant to go to Birmingham, going to Nottingham, going to Brighton, in order to meet with local people and to collaborate. Now it may means that we could do these meetings through Zoom. Probably is not as good as going locally, I think, and seeing perhaps where the child goes to a particular school, meeting the headmaster, the headmistress, and but it can be done now more easily, I suppose, to Zoom, so that this coordination can occur. But requires great skills and great understanding and respect of also different professionals, because this is an area where splits, as I said, tends to occur, that one aspect is idealized, another aspect is denigrated. Well, instead, what is important is that we need to find focus together in the meeting and as the time moves on, and respect people with different professionalities as well. But it's not an easy task. I think it's a lot of work.
I think, as I was saying earlier, because when you're dealing with young trans people, there is a time pressure if they're adolescent or reaching adolescence. There is that is a significant factor. I think because of that, that just emphasizes for me the fact that the productive use of the time that you have is not, well, like reaching back into this child's past and trying to figure out, like, well, what caused this? Why are they the way they are? You have your whole life to reflect on why you are the way you are. But in the case of treating gender dysphoria in young people, there is a factor to which the treatment becomes less effective with age. So I think that the focus should be on, like, what does this person need right now, because that is the thing that you can solve. Like, you can't go back in time and determine exactly why someone is the way they are, but you can help them with the problem they have right now. And speaking as someone who I came out in my late teens, so I wasn't treated as a child, but basically every trans person I know who came out in adulthood is very envious of those people who come out as young people and are able to be treated as teenagers. And I think it's incredibly valuable. It really can't be overstated how valuable it is to be seen and to be affirmed by your family and by the people who care for you at a young age.
Thank you, Felix. So we've got 3 more questions lined up, and Susan Matthews is next.
Thank you. I wanted to take up Domenico's idea of Bonnard revising his earlier paintings and invite him to return to those stories from the 1980s and the 1990s in the light of the exponential rise in referrals of teenagers, and particularly girls, typically aged sort of 14 or 15 over the last 10 years, and to ask him how that earlier model of psychoanalytic approach over quite a long period, maybe 2 years, sort of differed from what started happening over the last 10 years.
Thank you. Domenico.
Well, I suppose, first of all, the length of the time when people work is variable. With some people, you can engage for a longer time, with other people for a short period of time, and that will depend on the individual characteristics. Now, this huge increase, I don't know, it's difficult to know, I think, how much is the influence of social media, other factors, but also the availability of services to which you can make a reference. For instance, I can speak about UK. In UK, one of we applied for national funding, and one of the reasons for applying for national funding was that in certain region, it was easier to have access to a specialist service. In other region, there was no access. People not even knew that a service existed. So when in 2009, the service became nationally funded, that ensured some degree of equity to the old system. So maybe in some areas where there were no referrals, they start to build up new referrals, and that would be one reason of the increase. Now the availability, the knowledge that the service existed, the fact that you didn't have to go to a number of hoops in order to be referred, and so on. And then there might be also other factors, I think, which may temporarily affect people, and this probably are in social media, I think. And of course, part of the service is to have, in my view, I think, an open approach and be able, I suppose, to allow people to, I suppose, make choices and differentiate people, that's why I call the shapes of identity, differentiate the different shapes of identity, some which maybe are more temporary versus identities which are more solid. And of course, if you find yourself, identified in a solid way and live with a body that you don't like, then of course dysphoria will arise, because there is this discrepancy. For other people instead, they may find that living with their own body is a possibility, and so no need for physical intervention. So the services should be there to help people finding different pathways and be flexible enough to move from one to the other. Now, of course, there are an issue of resources, but as I was trying to show also, you can perhaps use the local resources for the most long-term intervention, maybe using Zoom, I think, for supervision, for consultation, and so on. So I can see that Zoom might be of help, I think, in this model of care.
Thank you, Domenico. I'm not sure what we think about more Zoom.
Well, it will be less, because it will be for some, but not for everybody. That might help with professional network meeting.
Yeah, indeed, that has made professional networks much easier. So next we have Ken, and then Elizabeth after that. Ken, I believe you are in Canada even. Welcome.
Hi, Ken.
Hello, Domenico and Polly. It snowed here today. So Domenico, I'd like to just follow up on what Susan Matthews just commented on, but I want to be a little more specific. So one of the most remarkable changes in our field over the past 15 years has been the change in the sex ratio of adolescents being referred clinically, from one that favored biological males to one that favors biological females. In my own practice right now, 70% of my clients who are adolescents are biological females, and embedded within that group, we have the new clinical phenomenon of what Lisa Littman termed rapid onset gender dysphoria in her 2018 paper in PLOS ONE, where the developmental history is of a kid who showed no signs of gender dysphoria in childhood, much less gender variant or gender non-conforming behavior. And middle school, early adolescence, these kids suddenly declare that they're trans or that they have gender dysphoria. And I'm wondering if you've been able to think much about this new clinical subgroup in terms of your own theorizing about identity, and if our clinical care model needs to be modified to address what are possibly different needs of this subgroup.
I'd like to comment on this if I may.
Yes, but I would like Domenico to answer first, please.
It would be a very brief answer. You know, I'm no longer clinical involved, you know, and so I don't have, you know, a first-hand contact with this new group of people. So I wouldn't be able to say. In general, I would say that this is part and parcel of the exploration, and which people where do belong. And so for some people might be a temporary. For other people, even if they started later in life, I used to see also in the past teenagers who would come to the gender clinic, you know, later on, I think when they were 15, 16, and with which would be what would be now called sudden onset. I remember, you know, Colette Schilland, you know, we had a discussion about one of these. She used to say, they are people with a vocation tardif, which in some sense nail it down. Some people who develop an interest, you know, later in life, and some people actually persisted. So I think it's difficult to predict, I think. But, you know, as I say, I don't have direct contact with this group of people, so unfortunately I can't be any more specific.
Okay, Felix, you wanted to make a comment.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I wanted to just mention that my understanding is that rapid onset gender dysphoria is not a formal diagnosis, and the study on which that term was based was of a group of parents on a forum for parents who were skeptical of their children's gender identity. So I don't think you can use that as a it's not an unbiased pool to draw that information from. And secondly, I would say that, well, I was someone who I was not at all a masculine child. I was very feminine. I had like waist length hair for most of my life. I liked, you know, dresses and dolls and all the rest of it. Gender dysphoria can be a very internal thing. And I think because it is very closely related to your body, especially if you're an adolescent, it can be something that you keep inside yourself for a long time, and something that you especially don't want to talk to your parents about. So when parents say, like, this came out of nowhere, this is really sudden, I think what is often happening is that it isn't sudden. It's something that that the person has been experiencing internally for a long time, and that it can take a long time to feel able to tell your parents about it. And then obviously it seems sudden to them, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it actually is sudden, or that it came out of nowhere, or it cropped up overnight. There's a really good essay by a writer called Daniel Lavery, who facetiously describes rapid onset gender dysphoria as a unwanted coming out disorder, because I think that is sometimes the reaction of some parents, is if they are skeptical of their child's trans identity, they will say, like, well, this came out of nowhere and therefore it can't be real. But I want to emphasize that most of the trans people I know don't actually fit the stereotype of, like, you know, being gender non-conforming all our lives, you know, always wanting to play with boys' toys or whatever. It's pretty common for people to only develop understandings of their themselves and their gender identity in adolescence or adulthood. And I am skeptical of a model that suggests that because it appears sudden to outsiders, then it necessarily has to be, that it necessarily is like, that's in and of itself concerning, when I think it's very natural for a lot of people to have it as a very profoundly internal experience for a long time before they feel able to share it.
Thank you, Felix. I think we have a sort of bookload of research questions accumulating here. So I'm just acknowledging that we're running a bit over. It's 7:38, but we have one more question, and then I'd love to ask our speakers to give some final reflections. So can I go to Elizabeth? Had a question, I believe.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to try and pull this all together. It's been such an interesting talk. And I think the thing that most struck me, actually, Felix, was what you said about one size doesn't fit all. Mm-hmm. And I think as clinicians and professionals and academics, we're often trying to find a meaning for what we're dealing with. And it's quite natural to look for causes, which I think you said, you're not interested in causes, actually, you're interested in solutions. And I thought that was really important. And I thought that really chimed, Domenico, with what you were saying about professionals being neutral. And I thought the list that you gave was really helpful. And I'm just going to repeat some of it. So non-judgmental acceptance, breaking the cycle of secrecy, alleviating shame, activating interest and curiosity, and encouraging exploration. And I think, speaking on behalf of clinicians who actually, we are the people trying to help individuals. We're also helping populations, but on a day-to-day basis, we're helping individuals. And we have lots of difficult work to do with them. And I liked very much your idea, as I said at the beginning, of the clinicians being the facilitators, being as neutral as we can, and trying to enable our patients to make the best decisions that they can. And in the case of children, that's obviously done in connection with their parents. But I suppose I just wanted to kind of conclude by saying it's a very difficult job to predict who is right for a certain intervention. I think on the whole, we get it pretty right, but we have to live with an element of uncertainty and risk, as we do in all other areas of our lives. But I found the information coming across today from both Felix and Domenico quite uplifting, actually. And I'm so sorry about my phone, which I can't seem to stop it from ringing. I think I'll leave it for there, but thank you very much to both of you.
Elizabeth, what a lovely resume and conclusion. Thank you for that. So I'd like to just ask Felix and Rowan and Domenico for some final thoughts, and then we'll close.
Yeah, you mentioned the element of risk and the fact that that's inherent to life, and I think it's important to emphasize that that is inherent to all medical care. So when people talk about oh, what if someone later decides that this wasn't right for them, that is the case for all medication. And in fact, the requirements that have to be met by both adolescent and adult trans people in this country in order to prove that that we should have access to gender affirming care are incredibly high. The average waiting time for an adult gender identity clinic in this country for a first appointment is now over 2 years. And in some clinics, it's as long as 5 years. So, and I believe the waiting lists for the GIDS service are also quite long. So trans people and, gender questioning people have much more opportunity than most people who are seeking medical care to contemplate whether the care that they are seeking is right for them or not. People have a right to make decisions that they may later change their mind about. That is part of the human condition. And I think it's really important to not view someone changing their mind as the worst possible outcome, when in fact the outcomes of adolescents, you know, not getting medical interventions that they need can be very, very serious and include self-harm and potentially suicide and suicidal ideation. I would view that as the worst possible outcome, as opposed to someone taking a course of treatment that they might change their mind about in the future. And I think it's really important to remember that doing nothing in the sense of not offering care is not a neutral option. It's like an actively harmful and often dangerous one. So I guess that is what I would like to conclude it with.
Thank you. Rowan, I don't know whether you had a final comment.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just a point not as a clinician, but as a informed member of the public, just the point about the change in the preponderance to where you have a high proportion of natal females coming forward. That's obviously a very striking statistic that is deserving of inquiry. I just would say it doesn't have to be conceived as necessarily a negative. There's a tendency to say there must be something wrong with that, but there's no reason to think that it is necessarily good or bad.
Yeah.
And also I think the time when there was a greater number of natal males coming forward, no one seemed to think that was a problem. So that's just a point I want to make about that. And then I think more generally in relation to Domenico's presentation, and what was really striking is the multitude of pathways that people take, and the story of Martina Martin was particularly revealing in that way. It just shows that everyone has a different route, really. And I think sometimes in this debate, there's a kind of assumption that, you know, a kid turns up at a gender clinic and says, you know, I like playing football, and then the next thing you know, they're kind of being put on blockers, and then they're being put on hormones, and then they're undergoing surgery. And you know, it's obviously not like that. So I'm very grateful to Domenico for just making that point that yes, some people can change their mind. They can truly believe that they are female at one point and then identify as male and so on. It's not a kind of a single track at all. So thank you.
Domenico.
Well, I want just to say that I enjoyed much more the second part of the meeting, the discussion, seeing maybe old colleagues and friends and Felix and Rowan and having their comments. The first part, I must say, I felt rather lonely. I didn't know what to expect, but certainly thank you very much for the second part, which became much more alive and interesting.
So I'd like to thank Domenico and Felix and Rowan so much. I think, Domenico, I always love hearing you speak. I love the way you use metaphors. I love the images of the individual seeds. And I think your compassion, curiosity, and inherent non-judgmentalness, if one can say that, are always conveyed in the way you think. And I find now, even after 20 years, that you spark thoughts and questions, and I think create an environment that facilitates thoughts. And I think, Felix and Rowan, it's made such a difference having you both here, to hear from someone with lived experience, being so honest and open and giving, really, and sharing your experience with us all. And to have your dad next to you, I particularly enjoyed the interactions of you handing over to each other. And maybe that's what Domenico needed, a second to pass over to sometimes.
Then, Paul, can I give a special thank you to Mike and Laura, I think, for their help. I mean, they were incredibly helpful, I think, especially for people like me, I think, who are technologically very behind.
And to Louise, I think, for so many fantastic events during this 100-year centenary. But I mean, I think, you know, just the final word would be, I think, you know, we've talked about some difficult issues, and I'd like to thank people for the thoughtful way they asked questions. I think we've heard a range of views, but I think more than anything, it's demonstrated the complexity and richness, really, of individuals and of identities. And so I'd like to thank you all very much, and thank you all for coming to listen. I hope to see you again.
Thank you all, and thank you, Polly, for chairing. Thank you.
Bye.